Hello, welcome to the um, uh, Finance 100, Principles of Finance. This is Dr. Jeff Hong, and welcome to the first class. Now, our first topic is ROI, or return on investment. And the pretty much, for everybody, the main reason to take the finance um, uh, or to learn about finance is to understand uh, how to maximize your return on investment. I mean, honest, uh, uh, let's be honest, right? How many of you are taking this course without any interest in the financial market? I mean, financial instruments, right? Such as stocks and bonds. And of course, there may be, there are other aspects of finance that you can still be interested in, but eventually, um, if you think about it, uh, finance is about um, making an investment, right? An investment comes right out of the savings, right? So think about it. If you have $10,000 today, right, that you don't urgently need to spend, what would you do with that? Well, the uh, in the absence of a better choice, then you would naturally put it in a bank, right? And if you put it in a bank, there will be an interest, right? Um, but of course, we know that the interest rate uh, these days is really immaterial. It's even mediocre. I mean, it's even derogatory. Not even, uh, not even 1% on the CDs, right? And on a regular savings account, it would be not even, 0.1%. And the Federal Reserve is even, uh, keeping it at, near 0%. I mean, when I say Federal Reserve is keeping it at 0%, that means, Fed funds rate. And we're going to be talking more about the Fed funds rate later on. But the idea is that this low interest rate or the benchmark uh, rate um, has been held at this level since 2008. And you all understand in 2008, there was a full-blown financial crisis, and it took almost a decade for the economy to recover from that financial crisis. Um, the By 2018, the Federal Reserve increased the interest rate a little. It was almost back to like 2 point something percent, right? 2 point at the at one point it was as high as 2.75%. But that's just the benchmark rate. Actual rate would be different depending on uh, the credit rating of the borrower. And but you know what? That was briefly lived, right? Uh, and in 2020, with the COVID-19 induced uh, recession, and which is almost like a depression, they dropped the rate again back to 0%. Now, um, you you may not remember the time when the interest rate was, the Fed funds rate or the benchmark rate was even as high as 15%, which was in around 1984. And on average, the benchmark rate has been, about 6%. It was like, the 100-year average, during the 20th century, and slightly starting from like late 19th century. I mean, if you take, because prior to late 19th century, the data is um, hard to find. I mean, consistent data is hard to find. But since like late 19th century, at least, we have um, consistent, written data about the interest rates, not only of the U.S. but also UK and uh, other countries at the time, other advanced countries at the time, which were are mainly Western Europe. Um, so if you take the average of interest rates for slightly over last 100 years, it is about 6%. So compared to that, historical average, still, even when they raised the interest rate in 2018, early 2018, it wasn't, in 2019, it wasn't even near the historical average, right? So, but think about it. If you keep your money in the bank, in the savings account, let's say you earn 6%, or to be more realistic now, 1%. Isn't that interest rate return on your money? Yes, of course, it is the return on your money, right? Um, so our question is then, is there a better return? I mean, can you get a better return on your money? Yes. If you, it's not guaranteed, um, but if you put it in some financial instruments like stocks and bonds, right? Um, Bonds, the return on the bond is generally uh, better than the bank interest rate, uh, and they are generally safer than stocks, and high grade bonds are very secure. Stocks, there's no guarantee, but you average out. Basically, sometimes you win, sometimes you lose, but if you average out, right, the return on the stocks are uh, much higher than, uh, much better than the return, the interest rate, which is your basically return on your money. So think about it. Um, Return on investment is that concept, right? It's the return on the money, but return not on the savings, which is guaranteed. Basically, even if it is 1%, it's guaranteed, isn't it right? If you put your money in the CD, certificate of deposit, right? That return is guaranteed, and the bank uses that money, right, to make a lending or to put it into the stock market. So if they earn, I mean, think about it. How can the bank give you a guaranteed return of 1%? Because they uh, uh, their return on investment is averaged out. Return on investment is much higher than 1%. So they can pay you 1% guaranteed, right? So then, uh, let's think about, how we calculate the return on investment. Okay. Now, this this slide, which was originally, PowerPoint, but I also saved it as PDF. So this PDF file can be uh, easily downloaded from our uh, Blackboard. If you go into the course materials section, the first topic is return on investment. And if you go into that folder, right, there you would find two files. One is, this PDF file, the slide, and then the Excel file. Let me just, let's go. Now, I don't want to stop sharing this because I will have to come back to this later anyway. But let me show you. Yeah, I, I would assume that it just eats up our time. So uh, uh, I will trust that you can find this file in your Blackboard, right? Yeah. So so return on investment is basically rate of return, right? And as I said, interest rate is the most basic form of return on investment, right? In that it is the return on the money that you saved, right? Now, um, and when we say return, the most crucial concept, crucial aspect or element we have to consider is how long is the holding period, right? Remember, when we say interest rate on the CDs these days is about 1%, it's just 0.95 or 1%. So, um, depending on the bank, some banks may pay you, slightly higher, like 1.25. Some banks may pay you like less than uh, 1%, like 0.9, 0.95%. But what does this mean? I mean, they give you 1% for keeping the money for how long, right? Look, uh, the bank interest rate is usually always quoted as annual. Okay, so it's called APR, and APR stands for annual percentage rate. Okay, they also use a term called APY, uh, which stands for annual percentage yield, and we will get into that later. APY is always slightly greater than APR, but they are not disconnected concepts. They are basically connected concepts. Uh, so what I'm uh, trying to say to you is that all the rates are basically annualized, right? It's based on annualized, holding period. So does that mean you have to keep your money at least, on annual basis, like 1 year, 2 years, um, yearly basis to calculate your return? No, you don't have to. I mean, in other words, holding period doesn't have to be only 1 year, right? Of course, the holding period can be 3 months, 6 months, or 10 days, 1 week, or any length of time. Because uh, uh, suppose you're buying a stock, right? You don't have to you don't have to hold it for 1 year. You will sell it whenever you think the timing is right, right? So holding period can be any length of time, but what I'm saying is um, for bank interest rate, um, the interest rate is based on the annual holding period. It's percentage, so that's why it is APR, annual percentage rate. And even though the holding period is not um, annual, even though holding period is shorter than a year, or random period, right, or 1.5 years, uh, the return is always calculated and um, converted into it, even if it is not annual, even if the holding period is not annual, eventually that holding period return will be converted into annual rate, or it will be annualized, right? So you understand the importance of this concept, why it is necessary to have it um, as annual, as annual rate, because by putting it into annualized rate, by annualizing all the rates, you can holding period returns, you can compare investment returns, return on investment, uh, with different time frames, right? Because think about it, you cannot directly compare the return uh, from the assets that you're holding for 5 years with the return from uh, investment that you are holding for just 1 year, because holding period is different, or something like holding for 2 years, because if the holding period is 5 years in asset A and 2 years in asset B, of course the return from the entire holding period would be greater when you in 5 year holdings, right, than 2 year holdings. You understand? Makes sense? The total return from 5 years um, holding an investment for 5 years would generally be greater than holding uh, an investment for 2 years or 1 year or 60 days. Makes sense? Of course, sometimes, it's not the necessarily, the holding period that determines it, right? I mean, even if you're holding it for just for uh, uh, 3 months, there is I mean, depending on which company. I mean, the growth, depending on the growth. Tesla was a good example of a uh, extraordinary growth, or uh, phenomenal growth, especially last year. Almost 800% growth, over just a few months. Uh, but then Tesla is last year in 2019. Uh, uh, Tesla, over just a few months period, it grew like Tesla grew like um, showed phenomenal growth, like 800%. Um, and then it dropped again, because when there's a sudden drastic uh, increase in the stock price, they try to take profit, they sell, and there's a large huge sell off, and after the sell off the price will drop. um, it dropped back to like 400. At one point it reached like $900, and then after the sell off, after they were profit taking, right, and then after realizing like 800% return, then uh, it dropped back to like $400 or $200, for uh, I don't I will have to look back. That was, I believe that was early this year, not necessarily last year. And then Now it is trading at around, $1,100. Um, Again, there's another company that has achieved about 500% growth, in the recent past, in the recent months. A company called hydrogen. I forgot the name. It's a hydrogen engine company. Oh, uh, Nikola. Nikola. I forgot. Nikola, spelled with K. Uh, but look, when they show such a tremendous short-term growth, right? Um, and they get noticed, uh, it's kind of too late to get in because the price. Uh, Now, that 500% gain has already been realized by some people, and the growth may not, from this point on, growth may not be that high, right? And they achieved it over, and still I would say it's still very speculative stock because nothing has been proven. They haven't made any engines. They haven't produced anything, and so it could be uh, a bubble. But for that matter, Tesla was just like that, even until like 2016 or 2000. Uh, anyway, so think about it. The concept of holding period return is important because it tells you, I mean, basically, not everything is annualized to begin with, right? When you calculate return, you will have to calculate the holding period return. And here's the example of I mean this here's the formula for holding period return. So holding period is like the total return over the entire holding period. Now this may look a little daunting to you, uh, but it's just algebra. Now, first of all, let's define what PT is. P sub T, P subscript T. It means, price at time T. And time T is let's say, two, the initial period, right? So it's like time zero when you started uh, uh, when you started that investment, right? When you put that money into that stock or into that investment, into that asset. So let's say it is 2010. Okay, so T is no numerical value; it's just the time subscript. Okay, P is the numerical value. P is the price, right? So if you put your money into this asset in 2010, that was the price in 2010, and it is 2020 now, and 2020 hasn't ended. So let's say uh, 2019 is the time when you sold it. Okay. Uh, Now, just to make it straightforward and simple, we assume that you purchased the asset at the end of 2010, and to make it 10 years exactly, let's assume you bought it at the end of 2009, okay? And you sold it at the end of 2019, then it makes it exactly 10 years, right? And another thing, end of 2009 is the same thing as the beginning of 2010, isn't it right? Hmm? End of, think about it, end of any year, end of any period, right? End of today is 12 midnight, which is also the 0 hour of tomorrow. right? Beginning of tomorrow. So it's the same concept. End of 2009 is the same thing as the beginning of 2010, right? December 31st, midnight is the same thing as 0 hour, January 1st of 2010. So either way, it's fine, but just to be consistent, price at the end of 2009, the price at the end of 2019. Then that's 10 years. So that means this n is then 10 years, right? If you're using the end of the year data, right? The data, the at the point at which we collect the data is the end of the year, the close data, the closing of that year, right? The price at the closing of the year, closing of the market, right? In that year. So, so if this is the price at 2009, end of 2009, price of at the end of 2019, and the growth between those two periods, growth over 10 years, is uh, calculated by subtracting p sub t from p sub t plus n. Makes sense? So this is the called capital gains, right? Which is the growth in the value of that asset. Of course, we must distinguish between growth and the growth rate because we are dealing with dollar values now. Growth rate is percentage. You cannot subtracting 2009 price from 2019 price doesn't give you a growth rate, right? It just gives you a growth in dollars, right? Dollar value. So that would be that's called capital gains. Okay. Uh, it could be capital loss if this is lower than, if this is less than this, right? Makes sense. But also if you divide it by PT, then that will give you the growth rate, but not yet. Just now, during this period, right? There may not be only capital gains. There can be additional cash flow, right? There are two types of cash flows from here, right? Um, there is capital gains, and then there is, let's say, dividends. If this is a stock, they will pay you dividend. If this is a bond, or they will pay you interest. Okay. So let's say annually for the last 10 years, you got, annual interest won't change. It will be the same amount, but if it is dividend, uh, it will be it can be different amount, right? It can be different. So if they are paying you dividends annually, dividends are paid quarterly, but if you add up quarterly dividends, then that's annual. For quarterly dividends, that's annual dividend, right? And then dividends may not, sometimes they don't pay dividends. Dividends can be skipped. Dividends can be skipped. Or some companies don't even pay any dividends. So it cannot be as regular as the interest, right? It may be sporadic sometimes, right? But anyway, if they paid dividends regularly every year, then there would be 10 dividend payments, right? That's called cash flow or income, right? But since it is cash flow anyway, I mean income is a kind of cash flow, right? Uh, more generic term is cash flow, right? So we'll call it cash flow. In this case, it would be dividend or interest income. And uh, if there were 10 of them, we can't write all 10 of them one by one because it will be tedious and it takes a lot of time. So what do? We use a summation sign. This is Greek character sigma, but which sigma is Roman alphabet S. So that stands for sum, right? So this is a summation notation, meaning look at the subscript t. T goes from 0 to n. So that means, in the first year, the dividend paid in the first year or cash flow in the first year will be CF0. In the second year, CF1, CF2, CF3, right? Makes sense? So by using a summation notation, right, then you can nicely condense all those 10 terms into a single notation, single expression. So this is the benefit of using, all these algebraic notations, right? So, and then think about it. Because these are all the cash flows from investing, right? And this is called capital gains, right? This is, additional income, right? And since these are basically your returns in dollars, right? You divide it, and you want to know what is the return. Return is basically what? Return is basically, output over input, right? This is your input, right? You made that investment. Benefit over cost, right? This is your cost, and this is your benefit, right? Now, that's holding the formula for holding period return. Okay, so now let me stop the video here and resume in a new video. It's almost about 30 minutes, and I want the videos in a short, manageable 30-minute segment.